Well, thank you for being here tonight. Our topic is a Christian response to anti-Semitism. And I wanted to begin with what I believe is the earliest case of anti-Semitism. Now, obviously, as long as there have been Jewish people, there have been individuals who didn't like particular Jews. But to turn that into public policy, I think you have to go back in the Bible to the story of Mordecai and Haman in the book of Esther. It's a historical and theological framework for understanding the roots and persistence of anti-Semitism. It was set in the Persian Empire during the reign of King Xerxes, Ahasuerus, with the Jewish people living in diaspora under foreign rule. Mordecai the Jew, was a figure of integrity who remained steadfast in his identity despite cultural pressures. Haman, who interestingly is a descendant of Agag, the king of the Amalekites, he holds a deep-seated animosity towards Jews, and that may be based on his family heritage. And of course, Esther, the queen of Persia, who was Jewish, who courageously advocates for her people despite risking her life. The story really begins in a major way with Mordecai's refusal to bow. The king had given Haman very special privileges. He would be considered the prime minister, and he wanted to honor Haman, and so there was an edict that everyone was to bow down to Haman. But as you know, Jews are very particular in the way in which they show honor to people. Now, there are instances where we find Jews bowing and showing honor in an appropriate way, but apparently in this instance, Mordecai did not feel it would be appropriate. We read in verse 2 of Esther 3, and all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. And Haman didn't like that. And his reaction, we find, is very extreme. But when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. This fury goes beyond personal offense. He seeks not only to punish Mordecai, but to destroy all Jews in Persia. We find his process of doing this is dehumanizing and defaming the Jews. The text goes on to tell us, then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, so they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. So this idea that the Jews are an odd people, they have their own laws, and the king ought not to tolerate them. Haman portrays the Jews as a subversive, dangerous group, and this is a common tactic in anti-Semitic rhetoric, where religious and cultural differences are exaggerated as threats. It goes on. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instructions to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. Now, in case you miss it, to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children. This is a pretty far-reaching, and there's no way of getting around what is intended with this. And then notice there is an economic incentive: plunder their goods once you've killed them all off. We find patterns of anti-Semitism revealed in the text. First of all, the identification of the other, the idea that you have all the good Persians. And by the way, the Persian Empire had all kinds of ethnicities within it. But the Jews were singled out as not fitting in. Haman's focus on Mordecai's Jewish identity over his individual actions reveal how hatred can become generalized and directed towards an entire group. This stereotyping is foundational in anti-Semitism, seen throughout history in various forms of discrimination and violence against the Jewish community. And there was an escalation from prejudice to genocidal intent. Haman's resentment escalates from personal disdain to orchestrated genocide, mirroring the dangerous progression from bias to systematic oppression. And using cultural and religious differences as a justification for this. As it said, their laws are different from those of every other people. Religious differences become the grounds for suspicion and hatred. This rationalization for discrimination has been repeated across the ages. Of course, the story goes on to describe Mordecai and Esther's response. Mordecai sent to his kinsman Esther and told her, you need to use your influence as queen to get the king to take care of this situation. And Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Well, there was a problem. And that is, according to the law, if you went into the king's chamber and he had not summoned you, one of two things would happen. He could hold out his scepter to you, and if he did, that meant, come on in, I'm well disposed towards you. If he didn't, you were summarily taken out and killed. So Esther went in, and the king held out his scepter, and she interceded. Then Esther approached the king and said, if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. And of course, as the story unfolds, Haman himself ends up being killed, and the Jews were delivered from their adversaries. This is an early example, but we find anti-Semitism repeating itself. For example, in medieval Europe, like in Persia, Jews in medieval Europe maintained unique religious and cultural practices, which often led to misunderstandings and suspicion. Medieval European authorities imposed restrictions on where Jews could live, what professions they could pursue, and whom they could marry, cementing their otherness. And perhaps the most important aspect of medieval anti-Semitism were the blood libels. The accusation that Jews used the blood of Christian children in religious rituals began in the 12th century and spread throughout Europe. The first instance of this was an 1144 case in Norwich, England, where Jews were accused of murdering a Christian boy, and it sparked similar accusations across Europe, what we think of as an urban legend. Things that were not documented, but boy, I've heard the Jews do that. Oh, there was that case in England where the Jews did this. Now, bear in mind, you're talking about the Middle Ages, where young people, children especially, died inexplicably. They didn't understand so many things. I wonder how many of them died of tetanus because a simple scratch of a rusty farm implement could kill a child within a day. And it was so easy to point and to say, maybe the Jews did that. We find economic restrictions. Due to restrictions in land ownership, in much of Europe, Jews could not own land. And guild membership. You see, through the Middle Ages, the guild system came into place, sort of like our trade unions today, but it was even stronger. And if you were not a member of the guild, you could not practice certain trades. And so you would have the cooperage guild, and they would be the ones making barrels. Well, if you weren't part of that guild, you couldn't do that. You were prohibited from plying that trade. Well, Jews could not join the guilds. And so many of them were forced into something they could do, which was money lending. Why could Jews lend money? Because the Catholic Church had a prohibition on the charging of interest. So if you were a baptized Catholic, you couldn't charge interest. But the Jews were not under that obligation, and so they became money lenders. Now, that profession is going to fuel a lot of stereotypes. The resentment and stereotypes surrounding Jewish money lending led to frequent debt cancellations. You get mad enough at these Jews who are the money lenders. And by the way, the governments of medieval Europe would often borrow money from Jewish lenders. Well, the easiest way to stick it to these Jewish money lenders is to legally cancel all debts. Well, since they were the only lenders, they were the ones who would be punished by that. There would be riots and confiscation of Jewish property. During the Black Death, there was a tremendous blame placed on Jewish communities. They didn't understand what caused the plague. And during the plague, Jews were scapegoated and accused of poisoning wells, which resulted in the massacre. So the plague moved through a community, and the rumor spread, oh, well, why is everyone dying? The Jews poisoned our water. Well, it would end up with the Jews being massacred on that basis. There was social and religious segregation in medieval Europe. The Catholic Church, in the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, so this is an official council of the Catholic Church, they required Jews to wear distinctive clothing so that you could look out and spot a Jew, enforcing their otherness and preventing social integration. And there were forced conversions and expulsions. Jews were expelled from England in 1290, from France in 1306, and Spain in 1492. By the way, Ferdinand and Isabella wouldn't charter Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World until they had taken care of this business of getting the Jews out of Spain. It's not by accident that it was in 1492 that the Jews were expelled. And the forced conversions. Jewish communities faced pressure to convert, notably during the Inquisition. Now, the Inquisition existed for centuries, and technically it still exists. Its name has been changed, but it's the Office of the Propagation of the Faith in the Catholic Church. But whenever you see the Inquisition, it's usually focused on the Spanish Inquisition, where, as an official arm of the Spanish government, again, it was chartered by Ferdinand and Isabella, the Grand Inquisitor, a man named Torquemada, would torture and apply all kinds of pressure to Jews to convert, and if they wouldn't, there would be an auto de fe. Auto de fe is actually Portuguese for an act of faith. An auto de fe is when you take a non-believer, tie him to a post, and burn him at the stake. That was the act of faith of the Inquisition. Anti-Semitism transitioned from medieval superstitions and scapegoating to increasingly institutionalized and politically motivated attacks, which laid the groundwork for modern anti-Semitic ideologies. The ghettoization in Central and Western Europe, the establishment of the Jewish ghetto in Venice in 1516 sets a pattern for enforced segregation throughout Europe, where they would say, okay, we've got these Jews, we're going to crowd you all into this rather undesirable place, and behind walls, you're going to live there because we don't want to deal with you at all. Now, you would think the Enlightenment might have provided some relief because the Enlightenment was anti-Catholic and was secular. But instead, you just have a rise of secular anti-Semitism. Unlike religious anti-Semitism, secular anti-Semitism portrayed Jews as economically threatening and incompatible with European society. So they weren't worried about the religious aspect, but they really didn't like that you had these other people. Writers like Voltaire and other Enlightenment thinkers reinforced stereotypes about Jews, undermining the Enlightenment's ideal of equality. Then the pogroms that we find in Eastern Europe. Russia in 1821, 1859, 1871, waves of violence against Jewish communities in Odessa, Kiev, and other parts of the Russian Empire. This is where the government would just tell the citizens of a district, well, you've got a Jewish town over here, you all just go on in and loot them. And the Jews would often be warned in advance that there's going to be a pogrom against you on such and so a date. And so they would try to flee. They would try to get out of there. But because everyone's trying to leave at once, the value of their property plummeted to nothing because no one's going to want to buy it. And they would try to get away. Many Jews came to America through this time. I actually knew a woman who had come as a very young child from one of the last of the Tsarist pogroms. She had arrived in the New World on a ship with her parents. It's a horrible thing that they had to face. And then the rise of political anti-Semitism in Europe. Interestingly, the first country where this really became integrated into public policy was in France. A growing anti-Jewish sentiment, especially within conservative and nationalistic movements. And then, of course, Germany. Remember, Germany did not exist as a political entity until the late 1800s. There were German states, not a German nation. But as Germany began to develop a national identity, the Jews that were among them were identified as being un-German. The Jews were viewed as enemies of the rising German state. And there was an influence of the political anti-Semitism on modern anti-Semitism. It was organized, contributing to later ideologies that culminated in systematic persecution. Now, it was in the time of the 1800s that we find the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and the Evolution of Conspiracy Theories. This work, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was a fabricated document purportedly outlining a Jewish plan for global domination, and it was falsely attributed to a Jewish council. Now, we do not know who wrote this document. There is some thought that it was actually crafted by the Tsarist government to provide a scapegoat, to provide an enemy that they could focus hatred towards, because the Tsar himself was not all that popular in Russia. And so if he could stoke hatred towards the Jews and let the rabble blow off some steam with some pogroms, well, how much the better. While it was published in Russia in the late 19th century, it quickly disseminated across Europe, being translated into many languages, becoming one of the most dangerous anti-Semitic propaganda tools. The protocols describe an alleged plot to control world governments, finances, and social institutions, reinforce stereotypes of Jews as manipulative and deceitful, furthering anti-Semitism on a massive scale. The protocols influence Nazi ideology and continues to fuel conspiracy theories today, underscoring the power of fabricated narratives in perpetuating prejudice. And of course, probably the best known anti-Semitism is the anti-Semitism that we find in Nazi Germany. I take this very, very personally because some people deny the Holocaust, but I had neighbors, the Slangers. Both of them were Holocaust survivors. And Mrs. Slanger told us that every night she could still hear the children screaming because she was in the death camp and the Allies were coming and were going to liberate the camp. And so the Germans were working around the clock to kill as many Jews as they could. And she was in line, and she would have been the next one to go in, and they could not physically squeeze her in. And they shut the door, and she heard them all screaming. Why did they do this? Well, there were various causes. Social Darwinism, belief in racial hierarchies with Jews depicted as an inferior race, threatening Aryan purity. And the pseudoscientific racism, ideas from thinkers like Houston Stewart Chamberlain and Alfred Rosenberg, influenced Nazi ideology, casting the Jews as biologically corrupt. And of course, Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf, the political manifesto that presented Jews as Germany's eternal enemy and calling for their removal. The Nazis began their policies against the Jews in 1933. Notably, the Nuremberg laws, promulgated in 1935, defined Jewish identity racially, not religiously. So, in other words, if your grandfather had been a Jew, but he had converted to Lutheranism, and that was documented, and by the way, very careful records of such things were kept by both the Catholic and Lutheran churches of who was converted and when they came in and so forth. But if it was shown that you had an ancestor, no matter how far removed, that was Jewish, you were viewed as being tainted with Jewish blood. And so on the basis of the Nuremberg laws, you were counted as a Jew. not because of religion, but because of your bloodline. It stripped Jews of citizenship and enforced segregation. They had an economic policy called Aryanization, which simply meant confiscating Jewish businesses and property, forcing the Jews out of the economy. There were employment restrictions. Jews were banned from professions like teaching, law, and medicine, which isolated them socially and economically. And then, and this actually is why I chose tonight to conduct this lecture, because this weekend will be the anniversary of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, the night of November 9th going into November 10th in 1938. It was a state-sponsored pogrom targeting Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues across Germany and Austria. Nazi thugs just simply went out. It was called the Night of Broken Glass because they shattered the windows. It marked the transition from economic and social exclusion to open violence, resulting in mass arrests and internments. At that point in time, they began to have ghettos and forced relocation. Jews had to move out. And this, of course, was the staging ground for the final solution, the Holocaust of 1941 to 1945. Through that time, approximately 6 million Jews were murdered alongside other targeted groups in one of history's most devastating genocides. But there's one final note to this. I mentioned the Jews being killed very quickly in the death camps as the Allies approached. But beyond that, there were death marches from 1944 to 1945. As the Allies advanced, Nazis forced Jewish prisoners to march long distances in deadly winter conditions to prevent their liberation. So they knew that Nazi Germany was falling. They knew that the Russians were coming from the east and the Americans and British and French were coming from the west. They knew that it was all going to be over. But rather than they themselves, these German officials, fleeing and just dropping everything, they viewed the extermination of these Jews to be of prime importance. Well, we look at all of that, and I have to say that for decades following the Second World War, Jews, especially in America, have had a very privileged position. They have lived in safety. There have been echoes of anti-Semitism. For example, our Ivy League schools in the 1940s and going forward adopted various quota schemes. And they did this specifically to limit the number of Jews who could get into their schools. And because Jews are very geographically concentrated, whenever Harvard said, okay, we're going to establish a quota of who can be admitted to Harvard, well, there can only be so many from New York City. Well, by definition, you're reducing the number of Jews who could come in. But this was a very soft anti-Semitism. But something changed about a year ago. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas launched a large-scale attack on Israel, killing and injuring civilians, including children and the elderly, with incidents of kidnapping and other violent acts. And I won't go into all that was done. You can look this up for yourself, but it was horrific. You had parents watching their small children killed. You had children having to watch their parents killed before they were. And by the way, how do we know it happened? Because many of the terrorists were wearing GoPro cameras and documenting it all. And whenever these videos were shown back in Gaza, the population of Gaza was pumping their fists in the air and celebrating this atrocity of the women being raped, of people being burned alive, horrible things. And these were almost all civilians. Now, when I say almost all civilians, you can't throw a stone in Israel without hitting a member of the Israel Defense Forces because they're everywhere. So there were some Defense Force people caught up in this, but it was an attack against civilians. The attacks resulted in over 1,200 Israeli deaths, and primarily civilians, making it the deadliest day in Israel's history. Additionally, more than 240 individuals were taken hostage. By the way, some of those had dual citizenship and were Americans that are still being held. It's a great tragedy that we don't talk about those Americans being held hostage. But let me put this into perspective. Israel's really a very small country. If you were to prorate this atrocity, if the 1,200 deaths and 240 hostages from the October 7th attacks were prorated to the population of the United States, it would equate to 23,174 deaths and 8,635 hostages. Think of how we would react as a nation if something like that were done. However, here in the United States, some individuals and groups praised the attacks, citing support for the resistance against Israel. Anti-Zionist rhetoric quickly morphed into anti-Semitism, as support for Palestinian causes crossed into open hostility towards Jewish people. Universities, including Ohio State, saw a wave of pro-Palestinian demonstrations with slogans and imagery that often demonized Jewish students and conflated Jewish identity with the state of Israel. Jewish students began feeling unsafe due to slogans like, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," which is a call for the elimination of Israel. From the river, that's the Jordan River, to the sea, that's the Mediterranean, it's the idea that we're going to get the Jews out of there. Increased incidents of anti-Semitic slogans, such as equating Israel with Nazism, accusations of genocide, and calls for death to Jews during protests. Vandalism targeting synagogues, Jewish community centers, and other symbols of Jewish life, with a marked increase in hate crimes against Jewish people. Now, these are tremendously underreported in our news media, but the instances of Jews being beaten up, week before last in Chicago, a Jewish man on his way to synagogue was stabbed by an Islamic immigrant. These things are happening. Social media saw a surge in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, such as Jewish control over media or finance, and hashtags vilifying Israel while using anti-Semitic rhetoric. Anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism have come together. Anti-Zionism holds Jews worldwide responsible for Israel's actions, blurring the lines between criticizing a state and targeting a people. Israel faces scrutiny and criticism unlike any other nation, with a focus that often excludes similar behaviors by other states, which is a form of anti-Semitism. whenever you hear expressed how much restraint Israel ought to be engaged in prosecuting the war against these terrorists, remember, we did not use any such restraint whenever we went against the Taliban. They have been more restrained than any nation ever has been in trying to avoid civilian casualties. But they are held up to a level of scrutiny that no other nation has had to endure. And I will underscore, in the Mideast, you only have one nation that is a democracy, and that is Israel. Every other nation is ruled by strong men or some other form of dictatorship. Denying Israel's right to self-determination as a Jewish state is denying the Jewish people the same national rights afforded to other groups. Now, with all this in mind, what are the salient features of anti-Semitism? Well, as we've seen, stereotyping and dehumanization. Anti-Semitism consistently involves portraying Jews as inherently different, morally inferior, or even subhuman. This dehumanization facilitates exclusion and violence against Jewish communities. The conspiracy theories and collective blame. Anti-Semitism often includes unfounded conspiracy theories suggesting that Jews seek global domination or manipulate societies from behind the scenes. Then there are religious, racial, and political adaptability seen by anti-Semitism. As we saw with the rise of the Enlightenment, it went from medieval religious anti-Semitism of the Catholic Church into a secular anti-Semitism, using many of the same ideas, but just dressing it in a different garb. Anti-Semitism has shown a unique adaptability across eras and ideologies. This adaptability allows anti-Semitism to persist under different guises. And then we often will find institutionalized discrimination and persecution. Throughout history, anti-Semitism has manifested through state-sponsored discrimination and violence, such as ghettos, expulsions, and restrictive laws, which isolated and marginalized Jewish communities. And the scapegoating in times of crisis. During periods of economic, political, or social upheaval, Jewish communities are often scapegoated as responsible for societal issues. Scapegoating amplifies pre-existing prejudices, intensifying public hostility and violence. Whether you're talking about the Black Death moving through Europe and the Jews being scapegoated there, or the worldwide depression of the 1930s, where it became very easy to say, well, why did the stock market crash? Oh, it was those Jews who wanted it to. Now, there are a couple of things that I do want to highlight. Legitimate disagreement with a Jew or a Jewish organization is not anti-Semitism. The state of Israel, for example, is simply a government. And as with any government, individuals can disagree with them. By the way, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, chose the day of the US presidential elections to fire his defense minister because he didn't want it in the headlines. And it hasn't been. But these Jews that are running Israel disagree politically among themselves. It's not anti-Semitism. It's not anti-Semitism to have a disagreement with a Jewish individual. And religious discussion, including seeking conversion, is not anti-Semitism. It is not anti-Semitic to sit down with a Jew and to talk about the way in which our religions differ and to seek to persuade a Jew to embrace Christianity. Now, Jews, by the way, don't do the opposite. Judaism does not practice conversions. If you wanted to become a Jew, the tradition is that the rabbi has to turn you down 3 times before he'll finally consent to talk with you about converting to Judaism. You wonder why Judaism is shrinking. But religious discussion is not anti-Semitism. So what is a Christian response to anti-Semitism? First of all, we need to recognize the value of every human being. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. Every person is created in the image of God and possesses inherent dignity and worth. Anti-Semitism denies this truth by devaluing Jewish individuals. Now, whenever you find a religious anti-Semite, a telltale sign of that is, how does that person treat the irreligious, someone who has no religion? And if they treat the irreligious better than they treat a Jew, then it's not their Christianity that's driving it, it's anti-Semitism. We do need to remember the Jewish roots of the Christian faith. The Apostle Paul deals with this in the book of Romans. They are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. Paul said simply that it was his heartfelt prayer that all Israel would be saved. God's covenant with Israel is integral to the story of redemption, and Jesus himself was Jewish. Recognizing this connection helps Christians appreciate and respect Jewish heritage and oppose any form of anti-Semitism. Further, we should reject hatred and embrace love for all. Let all that you do be done in love. 1 Corinthians 16:14. Jesus taught love even for enemies, which leaves no room for hatred or prejudice against anyone, including the Jewish people. Christians are to live out Christ's command to love, countering anti-Semitism with compassion and understanding. And we are to stand against injustice and advocate for the oppressed. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy, Proverbs 31:9. Christians are called to defend those who are marginalized or oppressed. Following Jesus means standing up for justice and truth wherever hatred exists. And we should seek reconciliation and promote peace. The Lord said in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Christians are called to be peacemakers, building bridges of understanding and reconciliation. Rather than fostering division or prejudice, Christians are to promote harmony and mutual respect. So with this overview, I hope you see the history of anti-Semitism and the reality that as Christians, we are called to follow a different path. This does not mean ignoring the differences between Christians and Jews. They are practicing a different religion, and they have not accepted Jesus as their Savior. And we must never gloss over that Judaism is a different religion. But that being said, they must not be singled out for any kind of special hatred. And in point of fact, we can find much more common ground with them as men and women of faith in terms of family values, in terms of moral order, there are many things where we have more common ground with a devout Jew than we would have with an irreligious person. With all of that, though, we should never tolerate a prejudice against any people, and one that is in ascendance in our culture right now is anti-Semitism. Are there any questions